We don't know that necessarily it's even the controller's fault. But one thing we do know, there was a lot of vision, and people should have been able to see that, at what point do you stop? At what point do you say, wow, that plane's getting a little bit close? So this is a tragedy that should not have happened. Please, sir.
All right, you've been listening to the update from President Trump. We are going to stay covering this in the background, and if they take questions, if the president takes questions, we will jump back in. Not much of an update as far as new facts, but we do know that the president of the United States pretty emphatically upset about the standards in the past. I'm just being my own opinion on this. Not sure of how well received that's going to be at this time, if it's now about policy as opposed to just about the loss of life and the fact that 67 people perished. But you could hear the anger in his voice, and if the anger, many people are going to agree that the anger is justified if it turns out to be some of the things he talked about, if the error was made in some of the areas that he's talking about. What he did say was it was a very clear night. There was visual. The visual was there, that the air traffic controllers had directed the helicopter to make a maneuver, but they had done it so late in the game that it was too late for that helicopter to maneuver out of the way of the jet airliner. They were at the same level, which he said multiple times, meaning they were flying at the same height. There was no difference in the height that they were flying. So this is where the mystery will, from the black box to the final words that were said. Also, the Army being involved because the military, the Department of Defense being involved because the crash happened between an Army Black Hawk helicopter and a commercial airliner. So you are going to have multiple agencies. And one of the things the president said that I'm sure not a lot of people caught or were paying attention to is he saw an angle from the Kennedy Center that showed the impact, and he said there's probably going to be multiple videos of impact because of how many cameras are looking up into the sky. That's also something that I think most people would know intellectually, but since this airport is in such proximity to the Capitol building, to the White House, there is kind of a system that the White House can tell when an aircraft is moving toward the White House. The same would be for the Capitol building. That the same type of warning system, an impact warning system that you have on commercial airliners when airliners get too close to each other, that these buildings have sensors on them as well when a flight is leaving the flight path for the airport, if that were to happen, God forbid. So there are cameras and there are sensors, and so I'm sure we will be, in the coming days, the American people will see many more videos or visions of what this looks like. But it's a tragic day. The president starting off talking about a moment of silence, dropping an expletive in part of the conversation, and how the standards had been changed. So again, this is where I guess many people are concerned is, was that the issue here? And if it turns out to be that issue, then the statements and the anger he has are going to be justified. If it turns out to be something else, we understand there will be many conversations today about the timing of the comments that the president made. That's going to be, I'm sure, a big part of the conversation. But those were the words of the president. There were press conferences earlier. There were updates that had shifted fairly quickly from a search and rescue to a recovery effort because the water was near freezing temperature, and there was about a 20-minute possibility of life living in that cold water before they were, that freezing cold and what happens to the body. So it's just a very rough morning, as it kind of puts the politics of America into perspective. Wanted to talk today a little bit about RFK Jr., but we do have a lot to get to as far as the country goes. At 8:35, we are going to speak with Congressman David Schweikert. The movements by the administration to pause a lot of the spending that was approved so that they could line item some of the spending and cut out what they believed was wasteful spending. And there was some were talked about yesterday by the new press secretary, but they have now rescinded that pause order because it was challenged in court and the judge had put a stay on it. Now, we don't have the details, at least I don't have the details of why the White House decided to pause it, but they say they are still looking through and they are going to try to line item some of the spending. And that's going to be the conversation with Schweikert this morning about spending in Washington, D.C., and is the Congress going to be are they going to be looking much more closely at what is inside a bill. It's the earmark spending and some of the other things that have been approved that when they see the light of day, when the American people see the spending, most Americans on both sides of the aisle believe it's not something we should be spending tax dollars on. So will there be more scrutiny before bills are passed? That's going to be a big part of the question. So we'll talk with Schweikert about that later on in the show. If you're around heading out to lunch at 11:05, make sure you tune in. We are going to speak to Derek Hall, who is the president and the CEO of the Arizona Diamondbacks, and we're going to talk to him about the piece of legislation making its way through the state legislature that would allow them to capture tax dollars. And without going into too much detail right now, this piece of legislation would not increase taxes, but it would allow the D-backs to capture sales taxes inside the stadium, inside of Chase Field, and it would allow them to do that so they could use that for structural repairs. There's a huge, massive, hundreds of $1 million investment by the D-backs for improvements, but there are some structural things that need to be cared for that they believe should be cared for by the county or tax dollars because the county, Maricopa County, owns that stadium. They own Chase Field. So we'll do that later on in the show, but focusing on this tragic occurrence that happened, no survivors expected, as I just said, and watching the video, and they were on their final approach, and again, I've flown in and out of this airport a number of times, but I'm certainly not an expert, but a lot of people that fly in and out of there very often, and I would imagine Schweikert is one of them. We may ask him about, what's going on, but it is a very tight space. Coming in from the direction they did, they had to make a very tight turn over Maryland, and then you make the approach and they were making that final approach into the airport, and I guess the runway was runway 33, which is a coordinates. It's just a northeasterly direction. That is a compass coordinate of 33. And so they were making their approach in, and as you watch at a distance, it was dark outside. You could just see some of the lights. It appeared as if this Black Hawk helicopter made kind of a motion almost sideways. There's a lot of notification equipment. We know that recently here in the skies of Phoenix, there were two planes that were on a collision course, but the notification systems in both aircraft told them one was to go, move downward and let's say west, and the other one was directed to move upward and east, and they avoided, but they came within a few hundred feet of each other, which is very, very close when you're moving at that speed. What stopped either of these aircraft from heeding that warning? What was it? There's all those questions are out there. But first and foremost, it's about the loss of life. It's in pretty shallow water. If you've watched any of the coverage this morning, which is helpful in the recovery effort, but they fear that 67 people, there is no expectation of anybody being saved. The plane went in very hard into the water. It was shallow water, but it's also hypothermia sets in, and there is an expectation of possible life of 20 minutes in that water. Well, there's no way anyone got to them in 20 minutes. So it's a very sad day as families have a notification line, and family and friends that has been set up in a press conference this morning with the mayor and many others. They talked about the expectation that this is a recovery effort for all 67 people. So it's a very difficult morning. Whenever anything like this happens, trying to make sense, I certainly don't want to guess, because guessing gets you in trouble of what could have caused this. But you're talking about a very elite battalion of pilots and some of the best aircraft in the world that flies these skies very often. They do it every day. They do it every night. Having a nighttime flight is not a rare occurrence. It was talked about it being a training flight, which it probably was, meaning there's no passengers on board. It's not a mission to carry a dignitary or a military brass somewhere. So it was a training flight. But you're talking about the elite of the United States Army and these pilots, because they are the ones that carry military brass and dignitaries. So if you're ever in D.C., and I've spent not a huge amount of time, but enough time in D.C., Black Hawks in the sky in D.C. is not a rare occurrence. It is something that happens all the time. The interaction between the aircraft, the helicopter aircraft, and the commercial aircraft that's flying in and out of the airport is something that is very, very common. So there are so many questions.
Thanks for watching the Mike Broomhead Show. Catch up on Amazing Arizonans, a KTAR News podcast, and click the button in the middle to subscribe.